Well, welcome to the Cup for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay, and I have the honor of being joined today by Pastor Stephanie Schneider from upstate New York. Pastor Steph and I have known each other for a very long time now. We went to seminary together, have been through the adventures of ministry together, and just glad to have you on the podcast, Steph.
I am glad to be here. I've been a follower and listener from day one, and I've been in person twice now at Canton when we come home to visit my husband's family in Brandon, and just glad to be here, and I'm grateful to always do sermon series with you.
Same here. It's always a fun collaboration together. So since you are a longtime listener and first-time guest on the podcast, if you want to give it just an opportunity to introduce yourself, where are you located? How does your appointment work? Or not really appointment, you're not United Methodist, but how does your call work? And what's your family like?
So I live in Glens Falls, New York, which is the base of the Adirondack. So if you know like Lake George area, if you're a history nerd, Lake George, Fort Ticonderoga, those are just north of me. I'm an hour north of Albany, not Albany, here. Gotta have a New York accent. And so I serve two churches for a total of half-time, which is absurd and unique across almost all denominations. So it's absurd to hear of a quarter-time position, and I have two of them. So I serve First Baptist Glens Falls and Village Baptist Fort Edward. Also, small fact, Fort Edward used to be one of the largest cities in the United States because the Continental Army was stationed on Rogers Island in Fort Edward for a winter.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So coming from North Dakota and seminary in South Dakota, it's very like the history here is really just rich and wonderful.
Yeah, wow.
It's fun to go into a cemetery and see like 1700 dates, which blows my mind. The first time I saw it, I was like, my home state wasn't even a state until 1881.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, great
little deeper history there. That's awesome.
Yeah, so our call system is a little bit different than Methodist. I'm American Baptist. It's kind of like, so the church puts together a profile and the pastors put together a profile, kind of like your blind dating. The regional exec, which would be like your DS, puts them together, and then you go through like the interview hiring process like you would with most jobs. And so we aren't moved. So like I'm 5.5 years in this location. I am not at risk of somebody saying, hey, it's time for a new appointment, which is great because I just bought a house on Friday.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, but even in the American Baptist, 7 years is the average. 3 to 10 is an average stay at a location. So you have some, that break the mold that are, the 25, 50-year pastorates, but you have some that are that 3-year, a lot of them that are that 3-year make or break ministry moments, move on kind of thing. So.
Interesting. I would not have guessed that. That just kind of, that goes against the narrative that I was taught of more of call-centered denominations. I would not have guessed that being the average tenure.
Mm-hmm. If you remember from seminary where they say like 3 years is like a make or break moment, you either decide as a church that you're moving in the same direction or you and the pastor just aren't working, like your honeymoon period is over. That's really the break point. And then somewhere in there's typically a massive conflict that happens within a church, just in normal church rhythm cycles. And it either seals the deal where it becomes a long pastorate or it doesn't. So, surprise, surprise, Baptists have as much conflicts as Methodists.
What? That's awesome.
I have 2 sons, a 6-month-old and a 3.5-year-old. And I am married to the luckiest guy alive. No, just kidding. I am the luckiest one. Just a really great, handsome, caring, carries the biggest weight load partner. He's my teammate. So his name is Andrew, and he's from Brandon, and we live here in upstate New York, as we have for 5.5 years. And we currently have a dog named Bruce.
Oh, yay, Bruce. Nice. Well, awesome. So glad to have you with us with me on the podcast, and just glad to introduce you to the listeners. I know I've made mention of you a number of times on the podcast because we've done a lot of stuff together, including this Advent series. And so just why don't we start there? Steph, since this Advent series, just so that people know, comes from our General Board of Discipleship on the United Methodist Church. So as an American Baptist, what drew you to this sermon series, Steph?
So I preached the last 2 weeks in Thanksgiving time, talking about Thanksgiving and Thanksgiving as resistance, Thanksgiving as a fighting back against not the powers of flesh and blood, but the spiritual forces, that it is an active way. And so I was reading through the Adventtide lectionary text, and I was kind of picking out like, okay, what am I going to read? And it just felt like everything specifically in Isaiah, the Isaiah text was just like where I had been leading up to all year. This make way for the king. And it was just, so then me being me, I was looking, Googling sermon series, sermon ideas using the Isaiah text in Advent, and I saw UMC, and then I happened to be like, I wonder what Clay's preaching, and looked at your preaching schedule and went, wonder if I can make a phone call. So that's how we ended up together. I had actually picked these texts out from the lectionary and was like, yeah. And based on UMC discipleship, Google is fantastic, right? Like you can find anything with Google, but to know it's been solidly thought through, it's what was in my brain already. Yeah. So.
Yep. Yeah. And I will say, from the United Methodist side of things, I really have grown to appreciate our General Board of Discipleship or discipleship ministries, however you want to phrase that. I'm old. I say General Board of Discipleship because that's what they're called. They've noticed that a lot of preachers are becoming sermon series type preachers. And there is such a beauty in taking these lectionary texts that have been a part of the church for 50, 60 years since the Revised Common Lectionary came out, and then taking them and saying, okay, how do we weave them together to make one coherent thought or stream of thoughts for a season, for a time, for a while? And so, they've really done a great job over the past couple of years, really, of really engaging in sermon series based on the lectionary, because the lectionary is a wonderful tool to use in ministry that brings us to passages of scripture that we might not necessarily use, but I was drawn to just the way that they highlighted both the gospel and the Isaiah text of just of really marrying those things together. Like this week was about God, we just pray that you would tear down the heavens and get down here and be down here, and that points us to Jesus, but that also points us to a bigger reality of there's a second coming happening that we're looking for. That's what we're really looking forward to and celebrating during Advent. And then pairing that idea of God rend the heavens and come down here with Mark saying, but Jesus says, stop trying to guess when it's going to happen, because no one really knows. We just wait patiently. We wait expectantly. We wait hopefully in this interim time. And with each week, there is just this marrying of a theme from Isaiah with the gospel text that really propels us forward into really clinging on to Jesus. We'll get on into this later, but this coming week is Peace Week. And it's, Isaiah 40 with comfort my people, and every valley being made level and every mountain being made low, and really preparing the way for Jesus. And the ways that John the Baptist did that in Mark's gospel, in the beginning parts of Mark's gospel. And then just, that idea of how we are doing that same work today as we prepare and as we wait for Jesus.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll get back to that.
Yeah.
That's for next week. Spoiler alert.
That is, yeah. We do a little preview at the end of the episode, as longtime listeners like Pastor Stephanie know. So, So what were your thoughts on this week's sermon, Steph?
You started off with this analogy and talking about you being risk adverse, which I know about you, but I didn't like. I see like you have a way of like emboldening people to take risk, and yet you are terrified to take risk. What was that?
It's just like, it's like the duck treading water, where like I can look calm on the surface, but underneath it's like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? How are we gonna do this? It's not gonna work. Yeah, that's how it works for me. Yep. Like I can make the decision to take the risk, but I'm gonna whine and moan the entire time, if not just internally.
Right. Well, so what is something that you've been weighing recently about risky hope? Right? Like, how did I write that? Yeah, or like weighing the risk on, is it worth taking? Is it, and then what are you learning about God, or how is God showing up in that hope in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate that one. This kind of digs way into where we're going in the future. But there's a sermon series that's going to be happening in January that I've been wrestling with for quite a while. There's also going to be an accompanying Bible study that goes along with it. It's a new book by Sue Nilsson Kibbe and Roz Picado, called Dynamite Prayer. And it's about breakthrough prayer, and launching a breakthrough prayer ministry here in the life of the church. And so I'm going to partner that Bible study with a sermon series on the Lord's Prayer of teach us to pray, give us this practical, tangible thing of how we actually do this. And then just bring that alongside that, a Bible study about really doing it. And so, we're going to be digging into that. And it's a risk for me because their breakthrough prayer is something that I've tried to do in previous appointments that has gone varying degrees of, I'm not going to say unsuccessful, but not as successful as I hoped it would be. Fewer people really grasped onto it than I had hoped or intended. And I kind of became disillusioned maybe a little bit, or just I've been wrestling with this now for 3 years here in the life of the church. Like, okay, how do we do breakthrough prayer here in a way that was different than I tried it in a previous appointment that kind of didn't really work? And so wrestling with that, and then just pulling the trigger and saying, there are ways that I was the problem. The risk of admitting that there were ways that I did it badly, and that's hard to wrestle with, and like looking and saying, okay, what are the pitfalls that I need to avoid this time? And like, maybe it was part of like it not being God's timing. Maybe it was a part of what the deficiencies in my leadership of this idea. But for better or for worse, for hook or for crook, we're going to go forward in January. We're going to talk about prayer, and we're going to launch something kind of new here as a way of just kind of digging back into what breakthrough prayer can look like in a congregation.
I'm excited to see and hear what's happening at Canton for that, and what that looks like, not just in Canton United Methodist Church, but what happens throughout the community in that breakthrough prayer. I have also not successfully launched a prayer ministry, and I'm not quite sure why. And maybe it's just my style as well.
Sure. But
yeah, no, I look forward to learning from you and from your church and what you're doing.
Yeah, it should be. I really am excited about it, and I really think that it could, just kind of be what we're looking for. Because I mean, this year has been a tough year for a lot of reasons. Between church disaffiliations, and like we never really had that conversation, which has been a huge blessing to me as pastor. That we are more or less solidly formed in our United Methodist identity. Like leadership team talked about it maybe once or twice, but nothing really came of it. But it has still weighed heavily because we've been a part of other churches situations, or like, my uncle says that we need to, or that, those outside of the shadow side of us being a connectional ministry of, they're my friends that have left the church, and they're my family members that have left the church. And, that's hard for all of us. That weighs on all of us. And then just, some other things in the life of our church, specifically in Canton. Yeah, it's been a hard year. And so this could really be a breath of fresh air for us. And really that, getting our spiritual lives intact and in order can really propel us forward to making 2024 a different year. And if I'm going to be brave enough to say, a better year in the life of our church. So I really think that grounding it in prayer is really the right way to start.
So I hear that, and I'm thinking hope.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we are in this shocking hope, and what, like, starting a prayer ministry in the face of what has happened, what is happening,
Mm-hmm.
and for Israel, right? Like, even talking about, like, Israel is in captivity at this time.
Right.
And are saying, okay, Lord, come quickly. Like, God, can you get us out of here? But yeah, hope in the face of flesh and blood things that we are experiencing, hope in the face of the spiritual that we're facing.
Right.
That's not just like, it's not shenanigans. That's not wishy-washy. That's not, blind trust.
Right. Yeah.
That's turning around and marching. To use like a war thought, like that's turning around and facing your adversary.
Right. Yep. Yep. And acknowledging that our adversary isn't necessarily the person next to us, but rather is, what Paul talks about, there being spiritual forces of wickedness, and there being, other, that our battle isn't one on earth. It's one in the spiritual realm. And yeah, we're going to fight through it. That's the risk that I'm being willing to take right now. The risk that I'm, leading our people into, for, lack of a better whatever. So Steph, what when you think about that question, what comes to mind for you in terms of risk and hopefulness and where God is leading?
So I mentioned in my intro that we bought a house on Friday. In the worst market in my lifetime, right? Right. So percentage on a mortgage is ridiculous. And we bought, not in the safest, cleanest neighborhood in town. And yet learning that it is a beautiful neighborhood of community, but it also happens to have a lot of multi-unit properties. And so having people coming out of prison as our neighbors. Right. So, but when we learned that, Andrew and I were just looked at each other, and my thought was, the only way for people to beat recidivism is to have good neighbors. And so let's be those neighbors. And so we had made the decision back in July that we were going to postpone buying a house for 2 years. And now it's December and we've bought a house. And so that was really, like, our house got sold that we were renting. But the decision was like, okay, so I'm 5.5 years into this ministry when we average 7 years. It's something like, I'm a little nervous. The shoe's going to drop, the bottom's going to fall out of something, church conflict is going to happen, and we'll have just bought a house here in the worst market. And so we just kept looking at each other in this whole house buying process. And I was like, okay, every time we've tried to buy a house in the past, there's been this like gut reaction of like, something is just not right. If we feel that again, we're not going to. And so we prayerfully considered that this entire thing. And Andrew would be really good of like checking in and being like, okay, how's your gut? I trust your gut. Are you feeling anything? And I'm like, no, just pressure to hurry up because house buying goes fast. Never done it before. And so I check in with him. How's your gut? Feels good. So here we are. We bought a house. And so my hope is to put down roots. This is the first time for Andrew and I, right? Like this is the longest time we've lived in one place. This is the longest time we've had jobs this long. Really putting down roots and the possibility of being in this community long term, and to the point of investing in real estate. And so I'm hopeful. I guess in the face of my fear, like this buying a house is intentionally hopeful, and just trusting that if it were not that case, that God would have spoken very clearly that with something, right? Even knowing, like, even in the knowing my neighbors were, are people that are not the most trustworthy possibly, that they have storied pasts, there was peace in that. And so, yeah, just trusting that. Yeah. Not saying God won't ever move us from this place, but for right now, for our family, this is the right place.
Nice. That's awesome. I mean, it stinks that you're in North New York, but it's all good. It's all good.
Saturday night, I sent you a Marco Polo. And I shared that I'd been at the hospital with a pastor who was dying of pancreatic cancer. And then I'd received news of a friend committing or dying by suicide. We're surrounded by all this information about Gaza and Israel and Hamas and Palestine. And what do I say to that person if they were to walk in my church on a Sunday talking about hope? And so how do you find hope in the midst of these horrible things? And how as Christians can we speak words of hope and pointing others to the coming Christ?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, I think the first thing that we have to do is acknowledge that things are hard, and acknowledge that life is messy, and that, I don't want to just like point back to original sin or original brokenness, but like we do live in a fallen and damaged world where things are not as they should be. That's where we meet Israel. Like in Israel, like they've been taken from their homeland for generations at this point. Like things are not as they should be, but yet they still have these present reminders of God's presence with them. And so like, this is not the time to have that conversation of like, yeah, but look at what God's doing. That's not a conversation to have right now. The conversation to have right now with your friend that, that completed suicide, or this pastor that's dying of pancreatic cancer, like this is not the time to have those conversations. That is just to acknowledge that, yep, that is hard, and that is not fair, and that is unjust, and that is outside of the realm of God's desires for us. But then just, to allow space for that to be true. And then, not to be trite, not to be cliche, but then just to say, but there's still this larger hope that we hold on to. And here are ways that we see that hope manifesting, and, God giving us little glimpses into how this is going to work, or how this is going to look going forward. Like the fact that God is still with us and God is still present, even in the midst of these hard times. Like I said on Sunday, the Israelites knew that God was with them, even in the midst of their exile. And they were sent prophets. Like Isaiah's, like the entire second half of Isaiah's prophetic ministry is just them hearing God calling out to them and saying, I know this is hard. I know that this, that this is not where you want to be and not how you intended life to be and not how you wanted your kids to grow up. But do not be afraid because I'm with you. Like, what we're going to talk about on Sunday, comfort my people. Like Isaiah, go forth and proclaim these words of comfort over the people of God. And so many times Jesus encountered people that were broken. Jesus encountered people that were hurting, people that had life not look how they wanted it to look. And through Jesus' healing, through Jesus' very presence, they knew hope was real. And I think that like through the power of the Spirit in our own lives and just, there are reminders that we're given, those conversations with friends, those random Marco Polos on a day where it's been a day. And, there's a friend saying, hey, was just thinking of you and just want you to know I'm praying for you. Like those types of things happen. And that it doesn't make it okay. Like, let's be honest, it doesn't make it okay, but it makes it manageable in a lot of ways. To like, we can still hold on to hope and believe that there's something bigger and better happening, even if we can't see it right this second.
One of the things as a pastor, I sometimes say in the midst of the death and dying is, or I've had a few people end up in like a behavioral health unit. Mm-hmm. Let me hold on to that hope for you.
Mm.
Do you trust me enough to hold that hope for you when you can't hold it?
Wow.
Right? Like the beauty of being Christians together is that we can hold on and hold up for each other in the midst of these things. I have another person in my realm of life that's newly struggling with addiction or recognizing that they struggle with addiction. And that idea of like, I can hold on. You could, right? So I mentioned this to another AA group that meets in our church, and they handed me their numbers. They said, you give this to that woman so she can come.
Oh.
Didn't know her, had never met her, like,
right.
And vice versa. Like, but the moment you think about picking up that drink, here you go. And that's the beauty. That's the beauty of doing this faith together, which leads me into my third question. You alluded to communion being a sense of hope. Can you expand on that more?
Of course. Yeah. That's one of my favorite topics. It wasn't in the sermon proper. It was in my invitation to the table where I was like, this is a meal with a promise. Like there is a promise so inherently connected to this story of this meal. And like from the very start, because this is the start of the Exodus. Like this is God delivering God's people from Hebrew or from Egyptian captivity. This is the meal that they ate. This is what they're remembering. Jesus has already gathered with his disciples for a remembrance of God's mighty acts of salvation among the people of God. And then Jesus flips it on its head by taking a common element of the table, a loaf of bread, and doing something uncommon with it as he says to them, this is my body. And he rips it into two, like, do you get this yet? And then the cup of, this is the cup of the poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins, the blood of the new covenant in my blood. And then Jesus says, we're going to do this again. This is a meal with a promise that we're going to eat of this bread and drink of this cup in the fullness of God's kingdom. We get to go to this feast together. We're doing this faith thing together, like you mentioned, and we get to experience this meal with beloved friends and holy strangers now. But yet, when the fullness of God's kingdom comes, it's going to be bread and cup. It's going to be us around the table with Jesus, feasting in a way that we can't even, like, my brain can't even handle it. Mm-hmm. But that's what's going to happen. That's what we hold on to. And like Jesus gave the bread and the cup as a reminder. Because like the disciple, like, we have this tradition. Paul taught it to the Corinthians and, and so on and so forth. Like these are the elements that the disciples came back to. Just, remember that Jesus made us this promise. And like when ministry got hard and when life was weird, they came back around these elements. And in the life of the church, we come back to these elements. We come back to this promise that God's still working, that God's still doing something, and that there is a time coming where we will feast in the heavenly banquet. And it just, it's a meal with a promise of future, future hope.
I'm on this like resistance against the spiritual forces, right? Like that's just where my brain is at. And so I'm picturing like a Star Wars joining the resistance. But like communion is like in the face of Darth Vader, right? Like the darkness, the spiritual darkness that it is, that holding up the bread and the cup is this act, this quiet defiance of everything and the hope that is to come. Like, I made the comment that the hope of Christmas is not some baby born in a manger. And my church was like, that's not what Christmas is about. And everyone was like, and I was like, no, it is in Jesus born, Jesus grown as an adult, Jesus ministry, Jesus dying on a cross, Jesus buried, resurrected, and ascended into heaven, and the promise of coming back again. That is our hope. It isn't, it doesn't end in a manger in a, wherever that manger was located, because
we don't know. Yeah.
Because it doesn't say, but we all assume it's a stable.
Right.
All we know is he was laid in a feeding trough, in a manger. But, right, like, that's not our hope, is a baby. It is the beginning of the hope.
Came from the sermon starter of like, we're not looking forward to a historic remembrance. We're looking forward to a new experience of God's presence with us made known in Jesus. Yeah. And like we use the birth of Jesus to talk about this, because this is when this is when God rent the heavens and God came down to live with us. And it just gives us the hope that it can happen again, because it's going to happen again.
Yeah, that foretaste of the feast to come.
But one of the things that you included in your sermon that I did not, that I would love to hear you talk about, is the Aleppo story. Could you tell me more about what that was?
So I've been doing this Bible study, or just this devotional on my own, called the Welcoming Table, and it's an Advent devotional. And on the first day, I read the story, and it was just like, this is hope. And so it talks about in 2016 in war-torn Aleppo, it was in the fourth year of the Syrian civil war, which is still going on. Everybody around the world is turning to Christmas, this joy, the feasts and the lights and gift giving and singing. And yet in Aleppo, imagine scenes that we're seeing in Gaza right now, right? Buildings exploded, dangerous bombs going, fighting happening, days without food or water or electricity. How do you even begin to celebrate Advent? How do you begin to put up a tree or a light? And so a local friar found ways to keep that spirit of Advent alive in their midst. He noticed that the waves of, and I'm going to quote it, it says how the waves of hatred and violence could so easily spread in the hearts of those affected. And so in response, his church made the commitment to being prophets of hope in their community. The commitment was fueled by the belief that small acts of hope can make a significant difference. The friar reminds us that it is in the small acts, when a person is sick, receives a blessing, a poor family receives money to cover medical expenses, a young man who is homeless and cold receives a thick, warm jacket, a child overwhelmed with fear experiences the joy of being with friends, that hope is reborn. So as Christmas grew closer, the people decorated the church and turned on all the lights, and these lights became more hope that the light of this Christmas season is still to come.
Mm.
Right. And the point I made in my sermon from there is that as Christians, we are called to be hope dealers. We're to be bearers of the hope in this world, much like this happening in 2016 and around the world. And going back to the Mark text, like that we are not only supposed to watch, but we are supposed to be proclaimers, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole lot easier to watch with other people around you. You know, hey, wake up. Hey, wake up. And so doing that helps us proclaim Christ for others to see.
Nice.
But yeah, it was just from a devotion, and it happened to pop up in the right day.
It goes back to, God providing us with those little reminders of God's continuing presence with us. Like when we feel hopeless or hope shaken or whatever, we read a thing and it just is the perfect thing. Yeah.
It's the way the Spirit works.
So what is next week for us?
Oh, next week is Isaiah chapter 40, which is the comfort, oh, comfort my people, says your God. And then going into John the Baptist, also quoting that same text. Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. I'm really, really stuck on that verse 4. This like notion that every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain and hill shall be made low and the uneven ground become level and the rough places, and then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, right? Like this idea of, and right, the glory of the Lord is not for those in the high, the glory of the Lord is not in the low. It is like until all people can see the glory of the Lord. Like God is working so that all the people, all creation can see God's glory.
Yep.
Yeah. I've got like all these thoughts running through my head, and I'm very excited about, but like just that verse is just right. And what shall I cry out? All flesh is grass, and the consistency is like a field. The grass wither and the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever, right? Like you and I are just in the grand scheme of a giant field, a blade of grass that withers so fast, but God is over all and in all around that field.
What does worship look like for you on Sunday, Steph?
On this Sunday, I preach at 9:30 at First Baptist and 11:15 at Village Baptist. And then
Eastern time, though, right?
Eastern time, yes. And so you can find us on Facebook Live, the First Baptist Church of Glens Falls, New York, or Village Baptist Church of Fort Edward, which means, technically you could catch both of them and your church service if you wanted to, because you preach like in my gap.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, I have definitely logged on to First Baptist a couple of times before church starts. So,
how about for you?
Yeah, so we have worship here at 10 o'clock Central Time here at the church, in person or on Facebook Live. And at 1:30 is our Chi Alpha Kids program for Christmas. So we get to have the Christmas program, which will also be live streamed on Facebook Live as well. So awesome. Yeah, it's going to be fun. And then so be sure to tune in to worship, whether you're at Village Baptist or First Baptist or Canton United Methodist Church or wherever you find yourself. And then join us for the podcast next week. Thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.